to referee the next round. But he has resurrected that franchise.
Yeah.
It has been truly remarkable. That was Death Valley before he got there. In just a couple of years, they are one of the title contenders, and they're one of the most exciting teams. And they got Steve Nash, they have Dirk Nowitzki, Michael Finley, Don Nelson's the coach, and they play an up and down style.
When you talk about Bill Walton, you're talking about one of the basketball's greatest enigmas, a towering talent whose legacy is a blend of brilliance and resilience. An Hall of Famer, MVP, NBA champion, and one of the most versatile big men to ever play the game. But look past the highlights and those mesmerizing passes, you'll see something else. The battles Walton fought to carve out his place. Throughout his career, he faced opponents who didn't just test his skills, they tested his limits. So let's dive into the players Bill Walton considers the toughest of his career. Moses Malone, the glass-eating machine. Fans knew Malone as the tireless, unyielding, rebounding machine who seemed to defy physics. But for Walton, he was more than that. He was a constant reminder of the sacrifices it took to play basketball at the highest level. Walton once described Malone with a mixture of admiration and exhaustion, saying, "Moses never stopped. Boxing him out was like trying to stop a bulldozer. That bulldozer mentality made every possession against Moses feel like a war of wills. And even when you thought the fight was over, Moses would keep coming back for more. But before Malone terrorized opposing defenses, he had to fight his way into basketball's elite." Born in Petersburg, Virginia, Malone made headlines immediately for skipping college altogether, a shocking move in 1974, and jumping straight to the professional ranks with the Utah Stars of the ABA at just 19 years old. For a lot of players, that would have been too overwhelming, but not for Moses. His work ethic and drive were evident from day one, earning him respect well before the merger brought him into the NBA. Walton often reflected on Malone's rise and upbringing, admiring how he came into the league, determined to dominate despite the unconventional path. Moses wasn't about fanfare, he was about results. He came from humble beginnings, and he brought that hunger onto the court every night, Walton said in one interview. And when Malone entered the NBA, his impact was immediate, scoring, rebounding. He could do it all, and he was building a reputation for being not only unstoppable, but uncontainable. Rebounding, however, became his trademark skill, the one that established Malone as one of the toughest players Walton ever faced. During their battles, it wasn't just Moses' size or strength that frustrated Walton, it was the IQ behind his rebounding. Throughout his career, Malone led the league in rebounding 6 times, but he didn't do it by jumping higher than everyone else or by relying purely on brute force. Instead, he had a sixth sense for where the ball was going, an instinct that earned him countless offensive rebounds. Walton explained this in one interview, saying, "He didn't jump higher than everyone, but it didn't matter. Moses had this instinct for where the ball was going, and he'd get to it no matter what." And their matchups were exhausting, especially when the trade that brought Malone to the Houston Rockets meant Walton's Trailblazers would see him more often. Walton was at the top of his game during Portland's championship run in 1977 and had faced plenty of great players before, but none like Moses. Malone was a force of nature in those games, making every possession feel like a battle. Walton vividly remembered how going up against Malone required a level of focus and energy that few could sustain. And what makes their rivalry even more fascinating is the way Malone's skills were put to the test against Bill Walton's Portland Trailblazers. One of Walton's lasting memories of Malone was his ability to rise to the occasion in crucial moments. Whether it was snagging offensive rebounds in the dying seconds of tight games or simply imposing his will on the paint, when his team needed him most, Moses seemed to have another gear, a level of intensity that Walton couldn't help but admire. Moses was a grinder, one of the hardest working players I've ever faced. He didn't care about how he looked doing it. All he cared about was winning, Walton admitted. The respect was mutual, but their battles were unforgettable. To fans, those games symbolized the kind of intensity that made basketball great. And off the court, while Malone's quiet demeanor often stood in contrast to his teammates and contemporaries, Walton believed it was part of what made Moses so focused and disciplined. He wasn't flashy like a ton of players were during his era. Moses came to work, punched the clock, and did his job better than almost anyone else, Walton mentioned in an interview years later. But the results were impossible to ignore. Moses earned 3 MVPs, an NBA title in 1983, and a Finals MVP that same year, solidifying him as one of the all-time greats. Even later in life, Walton didn't hesitate to declare Moses Malone as one of the toughest competitors he had ever faced. And for him, Malone wasn't just a matchup. He was a measuring stick, a force of nature who made every opponent raise their level or shrink in his presence. And while Walton ultimately carved out his own legacy in basketball history, few players shaped his journey as profoundly as Moses did. Whether it was the grind of rebounding battles or the sheer willpower to stay competitive against someone so determined, he left an everlasting mark on Walton's career and basketball as a whole. And moving on to the next player, it's why Walton considered him a nightmare. Julius Erving, the Doctor of Domination. Better known as Dr. J, Walton and Julius didn't just share the court. They shared battles that pushed both players to their limits and helped define their legacies. For Walton, playing against Erving was like facing a force of nature, a player whose grace and explosiveness left opponents gasping for solutions. But the brilliance of Dr. J wasn't just about flashy dunks or jaw-dropping highlights. Walton described Julius Erving as a player whose game combined beauty and devastation. His game wasn't just beautiful, it was damaging. He was a complete player who could devastate you in ways people didn't always appreciate. His defense, his rebounding, and leadership, Walton said in a podcast interview. Those words alone paint a picture of Erving's ability to impact every aspect of the game without ever letting up. His journey to dominance began long before he dazzled NBA fans. Before entering the league, he honed his skills in the ABA, where his aerial artistry and athleticism carved out his identity as one of professional basketball's transcendent stars. Fans flocked to see him in the ABA, where his signature moves, including his iconic acrobatic finishes, captivated crowds from coast to coast. By the time the ABA merged with the NBA, Erving had already earned the nickname The Doctor, symbolizing his ability to surgically dismantle defenses night after night. Walton knew Erving would be one of the toughest players he ever faced the moment Dr. J arrived in the league. You didn't need the scouting report to know Julius was going to tear you to pieces. His talent was obvious, but what really set him apart was the way he used it. It was controlled chaos, Walton said. And when the Philadelphia 76ers and Portland Trail Blazers clashed during Walton's career, the battles were nothing short of grueling, as both teams relied on their superstars to carry them through tough matchups. The pinnacle of their rivalry came in the 1977 NBA Finals, a series Walton would never forget. Facing Erving on the grandest stage in basketball was both an honor and an ordeal. Dr. J didn't just bring his A-game, he brought every ounce of his competitive spirit. Whether it was leaping past defenders for a thunderous dunk or locking down the Blazers' offense with suffocating defensive pressure, Erving's presence on the floor was inescapable. The Blazers ultimately emerged victorious in the series, but Walton admits victory was far from certain. Dr. J never let up. He never let you breathe. You had to bring everything against him, or he'd embarrass you in front of millions, Walton said. And those finals matchups were symphonies of competition between two of basketball's brightest stars. Walton, described as the cerebral tactician, relied on his footwork and passing to counter Erving's raw athleticism and spontaneity. And yet, there were moments when even Walton couldn't keep up with his brilliance. Even beyond the finals, they shared countless battles across regular season games, with Dr. J's Sixers often favored to dominate. Walton credits his leadership skills as a defining factor in their repeated success. He described how Erving carried himself with both humility and intensity, setting a tone his teammates couldn't help but follow. It wasn't just his talent, though that was plenty. It was the way he made his team better. Julius had this ability to lift everyone up without saying much. He led by example, and you could feel his presence in every moment of the game, Walton added. And one key moment that made Erving so difficult to contain was his versatility. Unlike many players who leaned on one dominant skill, Dr. J excelled in literally every area of basketball. Offensively, he was unstoppable. Defensively, he was a menace. In transition, he was untouchable. Walton described how challenging it was to prepare for such a complete player, explaining you'd try to predict his moves, but Julius kept you guessing. And for that, combined with his absurd athleticism, was what made him terrifying. Their battles weren't always about the scoreboard. They also represented two different approaches to basketball. Even decades later, Walton still ranks Erving among the greatest players he ever faced. For Walton, his impact transcends basketball, and for that reason, he represents an era where artistry and competitiveness merged into something timeless. A player who defined excellence and left everyone, even his fiercest rivals, in total admiration. And the next player was literally a master of mind games, and Walton only had a front row seat to witness it all. Charles Barkley, the undersized powerhouse. While Barkley stood at just 6'6", significantly undersized compared to most big men, Walton considered him a giant on the court in every sense of the word. In an interview, Walton described Barkley as a wrecking ball disguised as a basketball player. He made you question what you thought was possible in this sport. He didn't just play bigger than his size, he dominated like a guy 7 feet tall. And his path to greatness was built on defiance and raw athleticism. Coming out of college at Auburn University, Barkley was already shaking up perceptions. Known for his size and weight during his early years, he earned the nickname the Round Mound of Rebound. Barkley wasn't polished. He didn't fit the mold of what scouts were looking for when evaluating power forwards. Walton first encountered him when the young forward was making his mark in the league with the Philadelphia 76ers. His explosive style of play, characterized by powerful drives, relentless rebounding, and an unmatched energy, immediately stood out to Walton. Barkley wasn't content to fit in. His game was built on breaking the rules of convention, and Walton had a front row seat to witness it firsthand. And rebounding became his signature skill. He knew how to track a loose ball with precision and possessed a motor that never stopped running. Walton reflected on Barkley's rebounding ability with a mix of admiration and astonishment. Charles wasn't the tallest, and he wasn't the strongest, but somehow he always ended up with the ball. It wasn't luck, it was sheer willpower. He changed the way people thought about rebounding, and it wasn't about height, but about heart. Their matchups were nothing short of exhausting. Barkley's agility and explosiveness were almost terrifying at times, catching defenders off guard with bursts of power that seemed to come out of nowhere. Walton explained that Barkley had an ability to create mismatches even against bigger defenders. It wasn't just brute strength, it was how smart he was. He'd leave you guessing, and if you hesitated for even a second, he'd make you pay. And while his physicality made him a nightmare matchup, Walton also considered him one of the best trash talkers in the game, adding an unmatched mental aspect to their battles. And his trash talk wasn't just meant to rile up opponents, it was strategic, serving as a psychological tool to get under the skin of even the most composed players. Walton admitted that Barkley had an uncanny ability to personalize his trash talk, saying, "Charles made every matchup personal. He didn't just play against you, he got into your head." Trash talk was his way of controlling the narrative, and it worked. That legendary sense of humor made him entertaining during games, but his quick wit could also disarm players and throw them off their rhythm. In one battle, he had ability to dictate the pace of the entire game. Barkley wasn't a player who operated within a team system. He was the system. When Charles was on the floor, everything revolved around him. He controlled the tempo like no one else. You couldn't rush him, and you couldn't slow him down. The game went at the pace Charles wanted, Walton said. Their encounters were a blend of physicality and chaos, as Barkley often transformed routine plays into high-energy moments. Whether crashing the boards or setting screens that felt like collisions, his presence reshaped the flow of the game in a way Walton had rarely seen. And what Walton respected most about Barkley was never just his talent, but how competitive he was. Barkley's intensity was all about leaving everything on the court, no matter the outcome. Walton once said, "Charles didn't play for the stats or the accolades. It was deeper than that. He played for the fight, for the challenge itself." Barkley's raw love for the game resonated with Walton, especially during moments when their matchups turned into battles of sheer willpower. In these moments, Walton realized why Barkley would go on to become one of the all-time greats. Not because of his accolades, but because of the respect he commanded from everyone around him. And while his career is remembered for iconic highlights, Walton emphasized how those who played against him, as he did, saw something entirely unique. Barkley's legacy as one of the toughest players Walton ever faced was cemented by his ability to leave an impression, both on and off the court. Their careers ultimately intersected at a time when the game itself was evolving, but Barkley's ability to thrive in every situation solidified his place in basketball history. And for Walton, it's clear that those matchups lessons in greatness, taught by one of the most relentless competitors the sport has ever seen, Bob Lanier, the Big Lefty, the legendary big man. Known as the Big Lefty, Bob was more than just a dominant figure in basketball, a player whose size and strength made him one of the most physically imposing centers in NBA history. But it was the finesse, footwork, and strategic intelligence in his game that truly set him apart. For Walton, there was no relaxing when facing Lanier. Bob was one of those players who punished you in every way imaginable, Walton said in an interview, whether in the low block with his brute force or with his elbow-licking mid-range jumper, which, despite its subtlety, was very effective. His basketball journey began long before these epic clashes with Walton. Growing up in Buffalo, the future Hall of Famer didn't immediately seem destined for NBA greatness. He was cut from his high school basketball team because of his size 22 sneakers, deemed unsuitable for competitive play, a setback that might have crushed other players but only fueled his determination. Walton admired this kind of resilience and referred to Bob as a craftsman, not just on the court, but in how he approached the game and overcame the odds to dominate. He would go on to shine at St. Bonaventure University, becoming one of college basketball's most unstoppable forces, averaging over 27 points and 15 rebounds during his junior year and leading his team to the Final Four in 1970. Even back then, Walton remembers hearing whispers about Bob's dominance before they ever crossed paths. You could tell even then that he'd be a force in the NBA. He was ahead of his time, an innovator in a league still figuring out how to utilize big men with finesse. Bob entered the NBA as the first overall pick by the Detroit Pistons in 1970, a franchise that desperately needed a foundational star to turn their fortunes around. From the outset, Lanier made an impression as both fearless and technically gifted. Walton described him as unpredictable, in that he didn't just rely on his strength like many big centers. He could bait you, outthink you, and then strike like a chess master setting a trap. Bob played 3 moves ahead of everyone. And what he admired most about Bob wasn't the thunderous dunks. It was his deep understanding of the game. He knew when to use brute force and when to use finesse, a rare balance that often frustrated opponents. Walton said, "There were times you thought you had him pinned down, only for him to hit you with a left-handed hook or spin into an easy layup." And when Walton's Trailblazers faced off against Bob's Pistons, the battles were grueling contests of endurance, strategy, and pride. Walton recognized his aggressive scoring as one of his defining attributes, noting that even if you had a double team set up, he'd find a way to get to the basket. His left-handed touch seemed to defy physics, and his ability to dominate the post while also stepping out to hit mid-range jumpers made him a nightmare to defend. Both players had a mutual respect for each other, but that didn't make the battles any easier. Bob brought an intense competitive fire that matched his imposing frame, and Walton, on the other hand, felt it every time they squared off. He recalled that Bob's signature trait was his balance of power and precision, saying, "Bob didn't just push guys around, he outthought them. He's one of the smartest players I've ever dealt with, and offensively, his touch was unrivaled for a man of his size. Few centers in NBA history could boast such a reliable jump shot and fluid scoring mechanics from multiple spots on the floor. His career averages of 20 points and 10 rebounds were proof of his ability to dominate consistently." Walton once said, "Bob wasn't the kind of player you could contain all game. He chipped away at you, one move at a time, and by the end, you realize he's put up 30 and made it look effortless." And he also carried his teams as a leader, setting an example through his unrelenting work ethic and focus. Even in Detroit's darkest seasons, his presence gave the Pistons an identity, something physical and relentless. But his toughness was never just limited to basketball. It extended into his personal life and his battles with chronic injuries, a circumstance Walton could empathize with deeply given his own injury-plagued career. Bob's knees were a constant source of pain, yet he continued to show up, compete, and give everything he had. And Walton respected his approach to the game, calling him a fighter who refused to let pain or setbacks dictate the outcome of his career. His impact stretched far beyond the stat sheet. For Walton, he represented an era when big men weren't just rebounders or rim protectors. They were architects of the game, able to shape it with strategy, intelligence, and technical skill. And though injuries may have prevented Bob Lanier from reaching the absolute pinnacle of fame in the NBA, anyone who faced him knew they were dealing with a legend. To Walton, Lanier wasn't just an opponent. He was part of the education that turned him from a talented player into one of the smartest and most resilient big men of his time. And at the end of all, he left a legacy that shines in the respect and admiration of those who squared off against him, especially Bill Walton. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the Skyhook King. The legendary Kareem, 6 MVPs, 6 NBA championships, and arguably the most unstoppable move in the history of basketball, the Skyhook. Walton went head-to-head with Kareem in some of the most iconic matchups in NBA history, and while Walton held his own during these battles, he never hesitated to call Kareem the most unstoppable player I've ever seen. Much of that sentiment comes down to the Skyhook, a shot that defenders dreaded, coaches strategized against, and an entire generation of players simply couldn't answer. For Walton, defending the Skyhook was like trying to block perfection. Walton described it as almost mythical, saying there wasn't much you could do against the Skyhook except hope. It was like watching perfection every time he shot it. While the Skyhook remains the headline move of Kareem's career, Walton often emphasized that it wasn't just that signature shot that made Kareem so tough to face. His footwork, his positioning, and defensive timing, all of it worked together to make Kareem perhaps the most complete center Walton ever faced. But before we dive deeper into their legendary battles, let's just rewind to his origin story. Born as Lou Alcindor in New York City, Kareem was a towering prodigy long before making his name in the NBA. From dominating high school ball at Power Memorial Academy to leading UCLA to 3 consecutive NCAA championships, Kareem was seen as a generational talent. When he entered the league as the first overall pick for the Milwaukee Bucks in 1969, the expectations for his career were already sky high, and Kareem didn't just meet them, he obliterated them. Walton entered the league just 4 years later in 1974 after carving out his legend at UCLA under John Wooden, ironically following the same collegiate path as Kareem. From day one in the NBA, Walton knew that facing Kareem wasn't going to be anything like the collegiate matchups he dominated. By the time Walton arrived, Kareem had already won 3 league MVPs and an NBA championship, solidifying himself as the gold standard for centers. And throughout their storied careers, they faced off in high-stakes battles that demanded everything from their skill sets. Their matchups were about mental endurance, tactical adjustments, and sheer grit. It wasn't uncommon for Walton to watch tape after tape to try and decipher Kareem's movements on the court. But even with endless preparation, defending Kareem felt like an unsolvable puzzle. Walton said, "It wasn't just about his offense. Kareem controlled the game in every sense. His footwork could bait you into foul trouble, his defensive presence would alter your shot, and his stamina meant he wasn't disappearing in the fourth quarter. You couldn't let your guard down against him, not even for a second." And one of the defining moments in the Walton-Kareem rivalry came in the 1977 Western Conference Finals, a series that pitted Walton's Portland Trail Blazers against Kareem's Los Angeles Lakers. Portland swept the series, with Walton playing out of his mind and eventually leading his team to the NBA Finals, where they won their first and only championship. But even in victory, Walton admitted that Kareem pushed him to the brink during every game. Walton explained, "Playing against Kareem forced me to become better in every aspect of my game, mentally and strategically. He didn't allow mistakes dot, and defending the Skyhook is one thing, but Walton always pointed out that Kareem's brilliance wasn't confined to offense. His defense often doesn't get talked about enough." And another key aspect Walton admired about Kareem was his consistency. Night after night, year after year, he brought the same level of dominance regardless of the stakes. Walton reflected, Kareem wasn't playing for highlight reels or magazine covers. He was playing to win every single possession. That's rare. That's greatness. And what made their rivalry even more fascinating was the contrast between their personalities and styles of play. While Walton was known for his charisma and unorthodox flair, Kareem was reserved, cerebral, and methodical. Walton built his legend on passing and defense, while Kareem's legacy revolved around sheer dominance, whether it was scoring, blocking shots, or dictating pace. The battles between them often felt like chess matches, disguised as basketball games, with each play unfolding as part of a larger strategic war. Even decades later, Walton still speaks about Kareem with unwavering respect. When asked who was the toughest player he ever faced, Walton rarely hesitates to name Kareem. He's said the guy was a machine, but somehow still incredibly human.
The ultimate challenge. The same way that when I was able to play in the limited amount of time that I was able to get on the court, Kareem was the standard of excellence.
He worked harder, thought deeper, and understood the game better than any center I've ever seen. And the numbers tell part of the story. Kareem finished with 6 MVPs, 15 All-NBA selections, and the record as the NBA's all-time leading scorer before LeBron James surpassed it in 2023. But for Walton, it wasn't the numbers that stayed with him. It was the feeling, the helplessness when Kareem shot the skyhook, the exhaustion of trying to keep up with him defensively, and the respect earned through hours of battling him on the hardwood. Dave Cowens, the relentless competitor. Standing at 6'9", he was smaller than most of the big men he went against during the bruising NBA battles of the 1970s. But Cowens made up for it with sheer heart, grit, and unrelenting effort. Walton once described him as a non-stop motor, a guy who didn't take plays off ever. Cowens didn't just sprint for the sake of sprinting. Every ounce of his effort had a purpose, and against someone like Walton, it wasn't just about stopping him. It was about outworking him entirely. Growing up in Kentucky, Cowens wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. Basketball, for him, was not only sport, but battle. And this mindset served him well as he climbed the ranks from high school standout to shining star at Florida State University. His scrappiness was apparent even then. Coaches often remarked that Cowens had a knack for doing whatever the team needed, whether it was diving for loose balls or taking on much larger opponents. Despite his reputation as a fighter, Cowens wasn't exactly the type to land in highlight reels. No skyhooks, no flashy no-look passes. His was a style built on substance. But when he entered the league in 1970 as the 4th overall pick, Cowens quickly became one of Boston's new school stars, rejuvenating a franchise already steeped in tradition and greatness. His impact was immediate, earning all rookie honors and serving up performances that had veteran big men shaking their heads. And for Walton, he knew from the first time he faced Cowens that this was an entirely different beast to deal with. He didn't care really about matchups or stats, but he cared about winning every single possession. Their battles often felt like chaos incarnate. Cowens didn't wait for an opening. He created openings. Offensively, he had a knack for finding gaps in defenses. And Walton once explained that he wasn't a post-up specialist like Kareem. Instead, he thrived on being unpredictable. And what he really did was keeping defenders guessing and frustrated, forcing Walton and other centers to continuously adapt their defense or risk getting embarrassed. And despite being relentless, he wasn't free from adversity. His early career was peppered with moments of doubt, particularly when his unconventional style was questioned by those who saw him as an anomaly for traditional big men. But Cowens never buckled under outside pressure. Walton even remarked, Dave wasn't playing basketball for anyone's approval. He was playing for the moment, for the win, and for his team. You have no choice but to respect that. Walton respected him so much that he once admitted Cowens brought emotions to their matchups that few others could. I don't like losing. No one does. But against Dave, even when I lost, I grew. That's the kind of player he was. And their epic battles came during 1976 NBA Finals, often referred to as one of the most unforgettable finals in history. Walton's Trailblazers weren't involved, but as a spectator-turned-player analyst, he watched Cowens take over games against Phoenix. Cowens had the uncanny ability to seize critical moments just by doubling down on effort. His defense, rebounding, and even basket cuts seemed to elevate with the stakes. And off the court, Cowens garnered a reputation as one of basketball's most fiercely independent thinkers. Walton reflected on these qualities in interviews, praising Cowens' leadership style and the way that he demanded accountability from his teammates without ever raising his voice. Cowens wasn't a loud guy, but everyone knew he meant business. Walton explained this dynamic as saying, Dave didn't need to yell or trash talk. His presence spoke volumes. You couldn't slack off around him because if you did, he'd remind you, not with words, but by completely outplaying you. And years later, when Walton entered the Hall of Fame, he made it a point to mention the influence opponents like Cowens had on his career.
California played, of course, at UCLA with her brother and was always around, always wanting to learn. And Dave was one of those interesting characters who always thought I was too calm and too relaxed on the basketball court. And I'm very sorry that Dave could not be here tonight to share in our joy. Thank you, Ann.
How Cowens shaped not only his approach to basketball, but his perspective on resilience, strategy, and heart. Dave showed me that effort could trump everything else: size, skill, stats. None of it mattered if you didn't go all out. Walton's admiration for him endured long past their playing days, representing a mutual respect born from years of battles under the bright lights of NBA arenas. For Walton, basketball wasn't just about stats or accolades, it was about battles. And these pushed him to evolve his approach, refine his skills, and ultimately become the player that fans still admire today. Each one taught him something valuable about resilience, preparation, and the essence of greatness. And while his time on the hardwood may have been cut short by injuries, the respect he earned from battling these legends endures forever. All right, that's all for today. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.